Camden Prescott's fingers crushed into Lena Vale's throat at 3:12 a.m., grinding her airways shut against the steel edge of a crash cart while the oxygen monitor in room 3C screamed behind glass. His thumb dug under her jaw. His knuckles drove into the soft notch above her collarbone. She tried to pull air and got none. The corridor smelled like disinfectant, overheated wiring, and the metallic bite of fear. Her heels skidded on polished tile, then lost traction completely, and for one suspended second her toes barely touched the floor as his grip lifted and pinned and held. "Say it," Camden said. His voice carried that bored, expensive cruelty people used when they had never paid for anything. Not consequences, not shame, not the damage they left behind. He wore white designer sneakers without a mark on them, a black leather jacket over hospital scrubs that should have looked ridiculous but didn't in that hall because too many people had already learned to treat him like policy instead of a man. A $400 watch flashed every time he tightened his hand. Lena clawed at his wrist, thin fingers, iron underneath. He held his phone high with his free hand, filming her face as it went from red to violet, recording the panic in her eyes as if he were collecting proof of ownership. The front camera reflected him back for a heartbeat. Clean haircut, expensive teeth, and the flat smile of someone performing for a private audience. She knew where that video would go, not public. Worse. The private overnight thread where he posted staff mistakes, tears, stammers, and whatever he could use later. "Say no animals," he said, squeezing harder. "Say it so they hear you." Lena tried to answer and only managed a wet rasp. Behind Camden, a tan and black German shepherd fought the leash looped twice around the wrist of the hand holding his phone, body low, claws scraping for purchase on tile. Under the corridor fluorescence, the dog's saddleback coat flashed gold in one angle and went dark as iron in shadow. Camden jerked the leash hard enough to wrench the animal's neck sideways, not with fear, with spite, like he was punishing a witness. The sound the dog made stayed low in the chest, not loud, not frantic, a controlled warning that felt older than the hospital walls. Lena's pulse slammed against Camden's palm. She could hear it there, trapped between his skin and hers. She could hear her own blood before she could hear her own thoughts. She had trained for airway emergencies, for intubations done in moving chaos, for when to bag, when to call anesthesia, when to run. Training did not cover what to do when the person closing your airway wore an administrator badge and smiled into a camera while you faded at the edges. Room 3C alarmed again. Long tone. Drop. Recovery. Drop. Inside that room, Chief Petty Officer Miles Rourke was drowning by degrees in his own failing lungs, while a high-flow line hissed and his oxygen saturation slid in jagged numbers. He had asked for one thing through cracked lips every hour that shift, and Lena had heard it enough times that the words had lodged under her skin. Bring Ghost. Bring Ghost. Bring Ghost. Camden knew that too. That was why he had chosen this hallway and this hour and this woman. She tried to drive her knee upward. No space. Crash cart behind her. His thigh blocked. Her vision tunneled to the tendons in his hand, white under the skin, and the crescent marks where her nails had already failed to break him. "Look at me," he said, angling the phone closer. "Say policy." The corridor did not answer him. 21 people watched from the nurse station glass in the family waiting alcove while Lena's shoes dragged and her face darkened. 2 residents in wrinkled white coats, 9 nurses in night shift navy, 6 visitors with blankets around their shoulders, 3 transport techs with empty gurneys, 1 security guard with a radio clipped to his chest. 21 witnesses to a woman Losing air in front of a crash cart full of supplies meant to save exactly this kind of emergency. Not one moved. Nobody helped. A charge nurse stood at the medication scanner, 10 feet away, shoulders hunched, badge lanyard swaying with tiny movements as she kept passing vials under red light. Beep, beep, beep. Her eyes never left the barcode screen. She scanned as if the barcode mattered more than oxygen, more than spine, more than the human sound Lena made when she failed to inhale, and her body kept trying anyway. One resident took a half-step forward, then stopped when Camden turned his phone slightly and caught him in frame. The resident lowered his gaze to a chart tablet that was upside down in his hands. A visitor in a gray hoodie pulled a blanket over her mouth and watched through fabric. A transport tech looked at the elevator indicator as if willing it to change numbers could undo what he saw. The security guard touched his radio once, then dropped his hand and stayed rooted to the wall, uniform pressed, boots still, expression blank in the way people wore blankness when they wanted to survive a shift. Lena understood the room in flashes. She saw the calculation pass through everyone and settle into the same decision. Wait, maybe this ends. Maybe someone else takes the first risk. Maybe silence can be mistaken for neutrality. The world was full of people who mistook freezing for innocence. Camden laughed once, a short sound with no humor in it. See, he said to his phone. Nobody cares. Say it. He shook Ghost's leash again. The dog hit the end of it with a solid, muscular thud that sounded like a sandbag dropped against steel. Camden's hand snapped back, irritated more than shaken, and he yanked down hard enough to force the German shepherd's head low. The dog did not whine, did not fold. Ears forward, body locked, a growl building deep. Lena's hands were weaker now. Her fingers slipped down his sleeve and found nothing to hold. Her hearing narrowed until the hallway became distant and the monitor in 3C became a metronome for disaster. She thought of Miles behind glass, lungs scarred and stubborn, waiting for a dog that should have been at his bedside already. She thought of his grandson asleep in a vinyl chair 2 doors down, one sneaker off, hand still curled around a Navy Challenge coin. Camden tilted her chin higher and squeezed. Say no animals allowed, he said. Say it clear. Her tongue felt thick. Her lips shaped air without sound. Camden leaned in, amused, savoring the control, and for a raw second she smelled mint gum and cologne over antiseptic. Then Ghost moved. Not forward. Not yet. He shifted his weight exactly 1 step, hips angling, paws setting with deliberate precision, as if he had just solved a problem no human in that hallway could read. His ears rotated hard toward the cross-corridor entrance. His body went rigid enough to tremble at the edges. The low sound in his chest changed pitch, from warning to certainty. Camden didn't notice. He was still filming. Lena did. Even through fading vision, she saw it. Dogs did not lie. Not working dogs. Not dogs who had seen combat and came home with metals still lodged near bone. Ghost's alert meant one thing and one thing only. Truth was close. A chapter break interstitial would later frame that moment for the audience. People were asked where they were watching from, because what happened in that corridor belonged to everyone tired of watching. Power pretend it was policy. They were urged to subscribe if they believed veterans should never die alone behind glass, while cowards debated rules they only enforced on the powerless. They were told to stay to the very end, and they would see exactly how one hallway's silence was broken and exactly who paid for it. Camden pulled the leash again and forced Ghost's head down a second time, still grinning into the camera, still certain that money converted cruelty into procedure. 21 people remained frozen in fluorescent light, while Lena's airway narrowed by the second and the monitor in room 3C screamed for help no one gave. The hallway held its breath, and consequences stepped into range. Then Trey Carson stepped out of the cross-corridor shadow in NWU Type 3 camouflage, and the entire third floor recalculated what power meant. He did not hurry. That was the first thing Lena registered through the burn in her throat and the static closing at the edges of her vision. Men who panicked ran loud. Men who needed witnesses performed. Trey moved with the silence of someone who had already finished the math and did not need to show his work. Broad shoulders under green and brown digital pattern. Short, dark hair threaded gray at the temples. A scar along the right jaw that caught the fluorescent light like a pale wire. His hands were empty, scarred, and steady. Ghost felt him before the room did. The German shepherd's ears snapped fully forward. His body locked harder, paws planted, chest low, tan and black coat, turning gold under one bank of lights and dark as iron under the next. The growl in him changed again, not louder, just cleaner, as if the warning had found its destination. Camden still had the leash looped around his wrist, but the leash had stopped being a tether and turned into a line he did not control. The monitor in 3C shrieked another desaturation alarm. High tone. Drop. Camden glanced toward the movement, annoyed at first, then confused. He knew Trey as a problem on paperwork and phone calls, a retired SEAL who would not stop asking for one exception for one dying chief. He had never seen him in person at 3 a.m. with that expression, that level gaze, that posture, that made even the security guard stand straighter before he understood why. Camden's fingers tightened on Lena by reflex, trying to reassert the scene he had built. Lena's airway narrowed to a thread. Her pulse hammered under his thumb. She tried to focus on Trey's face and could not hold it, then found it again. Not anger, not pleading, not bargaining. Something colder, something final. A resident near the nurse station whispered, "That's him," and swallowed the rest. No one answered. Trey stopped 8 feet away, just outside Camden's reach, boots set shoulder width on the tile, as if he had measured the corridor with one glance. He took in the crash cart angle, Camden's phone camera, Lena's skin color, Ghost's hip position, the security guard's frozen hand near his radio, and the open chart tablet upside down in the resident's grip. His eyes paused on Lena's throat for less than a second, then returned to Camden's face. Camden lifted his chin, still filming, still trying to recover the script. "Back up," he said. "Family policy issue. Staff compliance training." The words sounded smaller than he intended. Trey said nothing yet. His breathing stayed even. The old field scars across his knuckles whitened as his fingers opened once and relaxed again. Lena could hear the rubber hiss of high-flow oxygen from 3C, the faint click of the charge nurse's scanner, still trying to continue its beeping ritual, and Ghost's low chest sound rolling under it all like distant thunder. The charge nurse finally missed the scan. Red light flashed. Error tone. Her hands shook. Camden felt the room shifting and hated it. He dragged Lena higher against the crash cart, forcing a choked gasp from her, and aimed his phone from Trey to her face again, searching for reaction. Any reaction. The kind that could be edited into a clip where he still looked like authority. "Say policy," he snapped at Lena. "Say no animals." Lena's lips moved. No sound. The security guard looked from Camden to Trey and back again, calculating payroll against liability, habit against conscience. He took one step off the wall, then another. Slow, uncertain, but moving now. One transport tech followed him by half a pace, empty hands raised as if approaching a ledge. Ghost shifted his weight toward Trey without taking a step, a precise lean that told his handler everything he needed to know. Pressure point, wrist angle, unstable stance, phone hand occupied. Trey gave the smallest nod, almost invisible. Camden caught it. Something in him flinched before his face did. He tightened the leash loop around his wrist and yanked down, trying to force Ghost's head to tile, trying to prove he still held something in that hallway. Ghost resisted with disciplined force. No lunge, no chaos. Pure torque through shoulders and spine. The leash burned across Camden's skin. For the first time that night, fear crossed his face fast enough that he could not hide it from his own camera. Trey took one step forward. Not enough to strike. Enough to make Camden understand distance as a weapon. Room 3C alarmed again, longer this time, and behind the glass, a figure moved at the bedside, trying to stabilize Chief Rourke without the therapist pinned in the hall. Lena heard a muffled voice through the door, urgent and clipped. "We need her now." Camden heard it too, and for a heartbeat he looked toward 3C. That broke his angle. His grip on Lena shifted from crushing precision to brute hold. Trey's voice came out low, level, and spare. "Look at me." Camden looked. Every bystander in that corridor felt the moment like pressure change before a storm front. Two residents moved closer together without planning to. A visitor lowered her blanket from her mouth. The charge nurse set the scanner down with a clatter and finally raised her eyes. The security guard's hand settled on his cuffs, not his radio. Camden tried to recover swagger and failed halfway. "You don't tell me what to do," he said, but it landed thin. Ghost went still enough to seem carved. Lena felt the tiniest thread of air return when Camden's thumb slipped from the notch above her collarbone. It was not enough. It was hope, and hope hurt when oxygen was short. She fixed on Trey's face because it was the only stable object left in her narrowing world. He did not blink much. He did not glance at the phone. He did not acknowledge the audience Camden thought he was performing for. He stood there like a closed door. Camden swallowed and did what entitled men did when control started leaking out through their fingers. He reached for inherited authority. "My father's name is on this building," he said. "You're done here." Trey's expression did not change. The monitor in 3C screamed again. Ghost's ears rotated once, hard toward the room, then back to Camden. Duty split between two emergencies and choosing both. The hallway held that frame of danger and decision in fluorescent light. 1 second stretched so tight it could have cut skin. "Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, because this corridor in Prescott Pavilion belongs to every person who has ever watched power mistake cruelty for policy. If you believe veterans should never die alone while institutions hide behind rules they only enforce on the powerless, subscribe and stay with this to the end. Stay to the last line, and you will see exactly how this silence broke, exactly who documented it, and exactly who paid when the footage stopped being private. Freeze the image for one breath longer and look at what 21 witnesses did with their hands. The resident with the upside-down tablet had finally turned it right side up, but he still was not reading it. His thumb hovered over an emergency call icon he had been too afraid to touch. The visitor in gray had dropped her blanket and was whispering a prayer she had not believed in for years. One transport tech had pulled his phone from his pocket and started recording, not for gossip, for evidence. Camera aimed at Camden's grip and the timestamp above the medication room door. The charge nurse, who had spent 10 minutes pretending barcodes were safer than courage, had both palms flat on the counter now, shoulders shaking as shame caught up to her in real time. Watch the security guard. He was not a villain. He was not a hero either. He was a man with 2 kids, a mortgage, and a supervisor who answered to the Prescott family. He had stood still because stillness kept paychecks coming. Then Trey appeared and made stillness feel like complicity instead of survival. The guard lifted his chin, keyed his radio at last, and spoke the words he should have spoken when Lena first hit the crash cart. "Code Gray, ICU third floor corridor. Staff assault in progress. Need restraints now." His voice cracked on the last word, and he said it again, stronger. Listen to the soundscape, while time stayed stretched thin. High-flow oxygen hissed from 3C. Telemetry alarm pulsed in jagged intervals. A bed wheel rattled somewhere down the hall, then stopped. Camden's phone camera autofocus with tiny mechanical clicks each time his hand trembled. Ghost's breath came measured, controlled through his nose, every exhale visible in the cool, over-conditioned air. Lena's inhale still snagged, short and ragged. But it existed now, and that single fact changed the moral weather. You could smell it, too, if you had stood there. Antiseptic and stale coffee from the nurse station. Plastic from unopened central line kits. The faint electrical warmth of charging carts. Camden's expensive cologne breaking apart under stress sweat. Ghost's coat carrying outside cold, and old leather from Trey's vehicle. Human fear has a scent, metallic and sharp, and by 3:13 it had spread from one pair of lungs to an entire corridor. Hold on, Lena, for a second, because policy language had tried to erase her into role and badge and shift assignment. She was 32, respiratory therapist, double certified, widow by 29, after a highway rollover took her husband on black ice north of Ridgemont. She had raised her sister's boy for 2 years before the sister stabilized and could parent again. She worked nights because nights paid differential, and because night staff learned the names of people. Daytime teams called difficult. She had already been written up twice for tone when she challenged Camden's orders about family visitation in high-acuity rooms. She knew exactly what he could do to her license, and had still said yes when Chief Rourke rasped, "Bring Ghost," through cracked lips and panic. That yes had a cost. She was paying it against the steel cart. Now look at Camden, because men like him depended on everyone seeing only one version. 27. Private school jawline. White sneakers still clean despite the struggle, because he never moved unless somebody else absorbed the mess. Overnight operations badge clipped where everyone could see it. His father's surname in brushed steel over the hospital entrance and over his conscience. He had built a private thread where staff tears became currency, and humiliation clips bought him loyalty from people who feared becoming the next video. He said the same sentence when challenged and meant it as law. "My father owns this hospital." The sentence had worked for years. It had bent nurses, intimidated residents, muted reports, rerouted complaints. It had never met Trey Carson in a corridor at 3:12 a.m. with Ghost locked on target and Room 3C alarming for a dying chief who had earned better than bureaucracy. And if you're still here, stay. What happened in the next moments was not random bravery, but the collision of training, loyalty, and a man who had confused inherited access with immunity. Camden's footage was about to become evidence he could not edit, while behind glass, Chief Petty Officer Miles Rourke was asking for one name, and that name had just brought consequences to his door. Time unpaused in a rush. The elevator at the far end opened with a ding, and 2 additional security officers stepped out carrying restraint gear, eyes wide as they took in the scene. The resident finally tapped his emergency icon. The transport tech kept recording, steady now. The charge nurse moved around the station with a trauma kit and nowhere safe to place it yet. Camden saw the reinforcements, saw the phones, saw the witness's changing shape from passive to active, and his grip on Lena turned desperate. Trey took one more step into range. Ghost rose an inch at the shoulders, silent and rigid, waiting for the word. Trey saw Ghost rise at the shoulders and lifted 2 fingers, a hand signal so slight most of the corridor missed it, and the dog held. The word stayed in Trey's mouth, unspoken, while the hallway trembled around him. Lena's pulse hammered against Camden's grip. Alarms kept slicing through the glass of room 3C, and 2 security officers slowed when they caught the look on Trey's face and understood they were stepping into a scene already measured to the inch. That was the held breath. That was the hinge. Now let's go back to the beginning, because no one in that corridor understood what Lena had already survived to stand there at all. Lena Vale had turned 32 3 weeks earlier at a kitchen table lit by one weak pendant bulb in a duplex she rented on Alder Street, where the freezer door never shut all the way unless you lifted and kicked it at the same time. She worked respiratory because lungs were honest. Numbers rose or fell. Effort either worked or failed, and there was no room for speeches when somebody was clawing at air. Her husband, Aaron, had died on black ice north of Ridgemont before dawn 3 winters earlier, and she had learned grief the way she learned vent settings, by repetition and no permission to stop. She kept his wedding ring on a key hook by the back door because wearing it at work made patients ask gentle questions she couldn't answer in 30-second charting windows. She had become the staff member families asked for by first name, not because she was soft, because she was precise and stayed. She checked cuff seals twice. She listened to chest sounds herself, even when monitors looked stable. She explained high-flow settings to terrified spouses in plain language at 2 a.m., then circled back 20 minutes later to make sure they understood, because panic erased memory. Night shift respected competence more than charm, and by her 2nd year in Prescott Pavilion's ICU, residents copied her setup before they copied attending physicians. By the 2nd week of October, she had started carrying protein bars in her scrub pocket for Chief Miles Rourke's grandson, who pretended he wasn't hungry and then ate in silent, controlled bites while staring at his grandfather's door. Miles had arrived 6 days earlier with end-stage pulmonary fibrosis, lungs stiffened into scarred paper by burn pit exposure. No brochure had warned him about when he was young and unbreakable. 68. Chief Petty Officer, widower for 11 years. Legal guardian to a 12-year-old boy named Eli, whose left shoelace was always untied and whose backpack still smelled faintly like pine from the cabin where he and Miles had lived before oxygen tanks took over the living room. The chart called Miles intermittently confused. Lena called him exhausted and terrified of drowning while still awake. Every hour, once panic rose and the mask felt like a hand over his face, he rasped the same request through dry lips. Bring Ghost. At first, Lena thought it was delirium language, one name among many patients reached for when sedation thinned. Then she watched what happened when the name was refused. His respiratory rate spiked from 24 to 38 in under a minute. Hands clawed at tubing. Saturation plunged. It wasn't fantasy. It was orientation. Ghost was an anchor point in a nervous system running out of options. Lena documented it every shift. Patient calms with repeated request for former service K9. Panic escalates when request denied. 3 days passed before she saw the first denial note stamped by overnight operations. No exceptions. No animals in ICU. She filed a formal variance request, citing palliative protocol and veteran-specific distress triggers. The request vanished from the queue by morning. She filed again with attending co-signature. Closed by administration for policy compliance. She printed the closure and put it in her locker because disappearing paperwork had become a pattern, and patterns meant somebody was curating risk. Lena was not reckless. She knew exactly who Camden Prescott was, what his surname purchased, how quickly a complaint became unprofessional tone in HR language when it came from a woman on nights. But she had watched Eli stand at the glass with both hands flat against it, while his grandfather shook in bed and whispered for a dog no one would allow through automatic doors under a metal sign that said, Prescott Pavilion, in brushed steel letters 2 feet high. She had watched a child calculate helplessness in real time. That image sat in her chest like a weight she carried shift to shift. On her 4th night with Miles, she found Eli asleep in the family alcove with one sneaker off and a Navy challenge coin clenched in his fist, hard enough to leave the eagle imprint in his palm. She eased the coin free, covered him with a warmed blanket, and read the inscription under the hallway light, Leave no one behind. She stood there longer than she meant to, because hospital policy had become the opposite of that sentence, and everyone knew it. When Miles was lucid, his voice came in narrow strips. He'll come if Ghost comes, he whispered once, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if listening to rotor wash nobody else could hear. Who'll come? Lena asked. Trey, Miles said. Dog finds truth faster than men. Lena had charted those words too. Not because charting was enough, because record was all staff had when power started deleting context. Camden Prescott learned her name on the second denial. He began stopping by rooms she covered between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., leaning in doorways with his phone in hand, reminding her which forms required his overnight approval, asking in a light voice whether she wanted a future in this hospital or a lesson. The first time she challenged him in front of witnesses, he smiled and said, Careful, Lena. Licenses are easier to lose than get. The second time, he filmed her while she adjusted a BiPAP strap and captioned the clip for his private thread. Night shift activist. Someone forwarded it anonymously. She saved that too. By late November, she had a folder in her locker with screenshots, closure timestamps, and 3 prior complaints from other staff members who had written and withdrawn statements after supervisory meetings they refused to describe. She did not call herself brave. She called herself tired of pretending process failures were random, and the process failures all led to one name. Camden was 27 and had never worked a bedside minute in his life, yet he held overnight authority over access exceptions, security escalation, and staff incident routing because his father chaired the foundation and treated hospital governance like inherited acreage. He wore scrub tops that cost more than a week of Lena's groceries, paired with white designer sneakers that had never touched slush, and a leather jacket in climate-controlled corridors where everyone else wore fleece with frayed cuffs. When staff challenged him, he answered with ownership language, not policy language. My father owns this hospital. My father funded this wing. My father decides who works here. By the first week of December, half the night staff knew Camden maintained 2 group chats. One was official, for bed status and transport bottlenecks. The other was invitation only, populated by young administrators, 2 off-duty deputies, and whoever wanted to stay in his favor. That chat traded clips of staff stumbles, copied badge photos, and jokes about discipline rounds. The humiliation looked childish until you mapped outcomes. People in clips got worst assignments, delayed PTO approvals, sudden chart audits, and whisper campaigns about competency. He had a system. He used credential access logs to track who entered restricted rooms after hours. He cross-referenced that with narcotic pull records when he wanted leverage. If he found nothing, he implied he had and waited for fear to do the rest. A resident with loans and no family money folded quickly. A single parent folded faster. One night in September, a nurse named Priya filed a report after Camden grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise when she refused to unlock a family consult room for one of his friends at 2:40 a.m. Security footage from that corridor corrupted before review. IT logged the loss as routine archival failure. Priya transferred to day surgery within 2 weeks and stopped making eye contact in elevators. Everyone understood the lesson. A primary care attending did try to challenge him formally. Dr. Ellen Ward wrote to the Board Compliance Committee that overnight operations had become a coercive bottleneck and cited 4 patient impact events, including delayed comfort exceptions for terminal cases. The committee chair thanked her for concern, then routed the complaint to hospital counsel, who happened to report to a Prescott cousin. The final memo called her allegations perceptual stress responses under staffing pressure. Dr. Ward stopped attending overnight committee calls after that. Camden's fatal flaw was not cruelty. Plenty of cruel people survived institutions for decades. His flaw was theatrical certainty. He filmed everything because he mistook documentation for dominance. He thought cameras belonged to him even when other people held them. He believed language could flatten reality if he said ownership often enough. In private, he laughed about night creatures and compliance pets. In public, he softened his tone around executives and spoke about throughput metrics, while other people cleaned up what he broke. 3 weeks before the corridor incident, he intercepted Lena outside Central Supply and told her, "Chief Rourke dies this month. This problem dies with him." He said it while checking his reflection in a darkened monitor, like he was rehearsing for a room he respected more than hers. She stared at him and said, "He has a name." Camden smiled without warmth. "Names are expensive," he said. "Policy is cheaper." That line spread through night shift by dawn, not because people found it shocking, because it sounded exactly like him. The institution around him had layers, and each layer bought silence. Security supervisors reported to operations leads who reported to an administrator Camden played golf with. HR investigations required witness statements, and witnesses had watched careers stall for less. Local deputies assigned to hospital calls often parked under a donor plaque engraved with Prescott family names, then walked in, already briefed by administrators before speaking to staff. The board's emergency subcommittee had 6 members. 3 owed campaign donations to the Prescott Foundation in county filings anybody could read. Untouchable was not a personality trait. It was architecture. By mid-December, even people who disliked Camden had started speaking about him in weather terms. Not if he would interfere. When. Not who he targeted. Who was closest when he needed a demonstration. Chief Rourke's request for Ghost became that demonstration because it challenged the one principle Camden could not tolerate, that compassion might outrank his control in a building carrying his family name. Every denied variance made him feel larger. Every frightened silence confirmed the model. And when Lena kept filing, kept documenting, kept saying the patient was terminal and coherent and specific, Camden decided to make an example where everyone on nights could see it. So at 3:12 a.m., in a third-floor ICU corridor that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, he put his hand on her throat and called it policy. That was the power source. That was the system that fed it. And 8 feet away, Trey Carson stood with Ghost at heel, 2 security officers closing in, a transport tech recording, and Camden still unaware that the architecture protecting him had already started to crack. Trey heard the cuffs on the approaching security officer tap against a belt clip, and the small metallic click split the corridor into clean angles. For half a second, the sound overlaid another night. Rotor wash, blood on gloves, a teammate gripping his sleeve and saying, "Don't let me go quiet." Then the memory burned off under fluorescent light, and the hospital returned in full. Camden Prescott braced against Lena Vale, Lena trapped against a crash cart, a phone held up to her face, room 3C alarms firing behind glass. Camden had Lena pinned with his forearm high under her jaw, pressure closing the soft tissue at the front of her airway while the steel rail of the cart dug into her lower back. His phone was canted in portrait mode inches from her mouth, recording every choke-thinned breath. The leash was looped around his wrist from the earlier jerk he had used to punish Ghost. The line cut across his sleeve and ran taut to the dog's harness. Camden's voice stayed sharp, performative, built for replay. "Say it. Say no animals. Say it clear." Lena's fingers were at his wrist, not clawing, not flailing, trying to create millimeters where air could pass. Her face had gone from flushed to blotchy pale under the corridor lights. Each inhale was short and high. Her body trying to compensate against compression, she understood clinically and felt viscerally. She could hear her own airflow turn to a whistle. She could hear the monitor in 3C stutter into another alarm run. She could hear Camden breathing easily. 21 people had watched this corridor freeze. Now the freeze was cracking at the edges. The transport tech, who had started recording, did not lower his phone. He shifted 2 steps left to keep Camden, Lena, and the room number placard in frame, timestamp visible in the corner. A unit secretary moved behind him and whispered, "Keep it steady." He nodded without looking away. 2 nurses, who had stood against the wall moments earlier, were now halfway into the hall, gloved hands up at chest level, ready but waiting for a clear opening that would not collapse Lena's trachea under a panic takedown. The first security guard, the one who had broken paralysis and called Code Gray, held his radio shoulder high and spoke again, voice tighter now that backup had arrived and still not moved. "Code Gray active, 3rd floor ICU corridor, staff assault in progress. Subject still has airway control on clinician. We need immediate command authorization for physical intervention." "Copy, Gray active," dispatch answered through static. "Supervisor en route. Hold scene." Hold scene. The 2 additional security officers from the elevator had restraint gear clipped and ready, eyes on Camden's base and hands, running the same calculation and reaching the same paralysis. One wrong angle could drive his forearm harder into Lena's throat. They spread to create a shallow triangle, one near the medication alcove, one by the hand sanitizer station. Both close enough to spring, and both waiting for someone else to own the first move. Room 3. C's monitor screamed again. The waveform reflected off glass and bounced down tile like a metronome for everything that was going wrong. Inside 3C, Chief Petty Officer Miles Rourke lay half-turned toward the door, oxygen mask fogging and clearing in uneven cycles. The pulse ox line dipped, recovered, dipped lower. His chart had documented it all shift. Panic spikes, desaturation with agitation, repeated coherent request, "Bring Ghost." The alarms now were not background noise. They were a running indictment with a decibel level. Lena heard one descending tone and got hit by a memory so brief it felt like a needle. Miles lifting 2 trembling fingers off the blanket at 1:47 a.m., eyes tracking her through fatigue, whispering around dry lips. "Not random, Lena. Bring Ghost so I can lock on something true." Then Camden's forearm shifted, and the memory vanished under pressure. Ghost stood with his weight slightly back, shoulders lifted, eyes fixed not on Camden's face, but on structure, wrist angle, leash tension, distance to Lena, line of approach from Trey. He had risen half an inch when Trey entered from the cross corridor, then stopped on the two-finger hold signal and stayed. No bark, no lunge. Ears forward, tail level, every muscle loaded and contained. The old hip did not show. Discipline did. Trey stayed at immediate intervention distance, boots planted on the seam between tile squares, left side angled to reduce target profile, right hand open where everyone could see it. NWU Type 3 sleeves pulled tight over forearms. Jaw set. Eyes moving between Camden's grip, Lena's airway, security foot placement, Ghost's line. He did not look at the phones. He did not look at the staring faces. He controlled tempo by refusing Camden's. "Camden," he said, voice flat enough to cut through the alarms, "take your forearm off her throat." Camden laughed once through his nose without looking away from his own camera preview. "You don't give me orders in my hospital." He jacked his forearm higher to prove it, and Lena's head struck metal with a hard, hollow note from the crash cart handle. A nurse flinched audibly. Ghost's shoulders rose one notch. Trey's left hand flashed 2 fingers again, hold, and Ghost settled back to threshold. Camden angled the phone closer to Lena's lips. "Say policy. Say no animals. Say it so everybody hears." Lena forced a fragment of air through compressed tissue. "Miles." It broke into a cough she could not complete. Camden pressed harder. "No animals." The security guard nearest the alcove shifted his lead foot in, then checked himself when Camden's elbow tightened and Lena made a strangled sound. The second guard swore quietly under his breath and unclipped one restraint strap anyway, telegraphing readiness even if command still hid behind procedure. Bystander inertia kept changing shape. It was no longer stillness. It was a ring of people leaning toward action and waiting for one event to legitimize what they already knew. A respiratory resident stepped out of a doorway with suction tubing in hand and stopped dead at the sight, then planted by the wall instead of retreating. A janitor set down a mop bucket and stayed, both hands on the handle like a staff. A visitor who had been crying into her sleeve in the waiting nook stood up and moved her body between Eli and the corridor opening, blocking his line of sight while he asked what was happening in a voice gone thin. Eli's name hit Lena like another flash memory. His sneakers untied, sitting in the overnight family chair 2 hours earlier, trying to fold a paper crane on top of a consent packet, asking if Ghost would make Grandpa breathe slower like before. She had told him she was working on it. She had meant it. The promise burned now under Camden's grip. Trey took one measured step forward. Camden noticed that finally and snapped his head up. "Back up," Camden said. "You and that dog are trespassing. I'll have every one of you out on charges." "Charges are already being documented," Trey said, and tilted his chin 2 degrees toward the transport tech's time-stamped frame. "Release her now." Camden's eyes flicked toward the recording phone, and then to the first security guard's radio. For the first time, the certainty in his posture showed a seam. Not surrender, not even retreat. Just a calculation interrupted by new variables he did not control. He doubled down by performing for the camera in his own hand. "This clinician is refusing policy compliance. I am de-escalating an unauthorized animal incursion." He shook Lena once to keep her in frame. "State no animals." Lena's vision tunneled at the edges, but training cut through. She dragged one breath, then another, each one scraping. "Variance, request, documented," she forced out, words clipped by pressure. "Miles, trigger, approved clinical rationale." Camden's face changed when she said documented. A muscle jumped at his jaw. The first security guard keyed his radio again, faster now. "Subject is interfering with victim speech and maintaining choke. Repeat, active Choke in progress. Request immediate go code for contact team. Dispatch came back with a new voice, older command cadence. Go code authorized. Preserve airway first. Coordinate. The words landed, and the corridor physically shifted. The two security officers moved one step each, synchronized now that responsibility had a signature. The one near the alcove lowered his center of gravity and opened his hands. The one by sanitizer station angled to Camden's right flank, where the phone hand was exposed. Neither rushed. Both stared at Camden's elbows. Trey did not wait for their timing to drift. He gave them the frame. On my count, he said without raising volume. Primary sec takes phone arm. Secondary sec clears leash wrist. I take center line if he drives down. Keep her neck neutral. Camden barked a laugh that broke halfway through. You think you run this? Room 3C alarmed again. Longer this time, the kind of sustained tone that pulled clinical staff by reflex. A nurse inside the room looked up through glass, saw Lena trapped, saw security braced, and slapped the silent call button with the heel of her hand. Another clinician appeared behind her and pointed at Miles's monitor, then at the door, then at Lena. The moral geometry became impossible to ignore. One patient destabilizing, one therapist being assaulted, one administrator weaponizing policy and camera angle while pretending this was order. Ghost lowered his head a fraction and shifted weight to his front paws, awaiting branch command. Trey saw it in peripheral vision and made no mistake with it. The dog was ready for a controlled forward block if Camden surged, not a bite command. Trey kept the line in his fingers, light and precise. Ghost, he said quietly, not taking eyes off Camden. Hold. Ghost held. Camden yanked the leash in reflex, trying to reassert the old dynamic. The line moved inches and stopped dead in Trey's grip. It was the first time Camden had felt the leash answer from someone else. For one exposed second, Camden's attention split between dog, camera, and choking arm. That split was enough for Lena to turn her chin a few degrees and clear a sliver of airway. She sucked in a ragged breath that sounded like torn paper. The transport tech stepped backward to widen frame as the security officers advanced. Timestamp still visible. No shaking now. A physician at the nurse's station finally raised her voice to the room at large, not to Camden. Witnesses, stay where you are. Keep line of sight. Do not crowd the takedown path. People obeyed. The corridor became a controlled channel instead of a mob. Even fear started following instructions. Trey saw Camden register that too. The witnesses no longer isolated. The phones no longer private. The security no longer ornamental. The dog no longer in his hand. The narrative no longer his. The antagonist, who had ruled through selective humiliation, looked suddenly like a man discovering he had mistaken institutional delay for immunity. He tried one more command through Lena's collapsing breath. Say no animals, he hissed into her ear, voice lower now, stripped of performance. Lena answered with what air she had. Bring Ghost. It was barely sound. It carried anyway. The first security officer was now within arm's reach, knees bent, palms open. Mr. Prescott, he said, using formal address as a last legal step, release her and place the phone down. Camden did not comply. The second officer moved to flank, restraint strap looped and ready. Trey shifted half a step closer, shoulder line now directly opposite Camden's chest, close enough to engage if Camden drove forward or dropped weight onto Lena's neck. Ghost rose just enough for traction, silent, eyes hard on Camden's wrist. Another brief memory sparked in Trey from the smell of antiseptic and overheated electronics. Miles in flannel at the range day table, oxygen tubing tucked behind his ears, saying with a rasped half-smile, "Heroes end up in small print." Then the present snapped back under alarm tone and fluorescent hum. Trey's voice came level, carrying to Camden, security, and every witness who had stopped pretending this was ambiguous. "Camden, last warning. Let her go." Camden's confidence finally showed the collapse it had been hiding. His mouth opened to issue another policy line, but his gaze flicked to the recording timestamp, then to the radio in the guard's hand, then to the two officers bracketing his arms, then to Ghost's fixed stare and Trey's unmoving stance. His grip did not fully release, yet the pressure changed. Less certainty, more clutch. Trey took the final step into intervention range. "Let her go." Camden's mouth curled, and he tried to drag authority back into his voice. "My father owns this hospital. Nobody in that corridor believed the sentence the way they had 10 minutes earlier." That was the shift Lena felt before she could fully fill her lungs. The words still hung in disinfectant air, but they no longer landed like law. They landed like a man reciting a passcode that had just expired. The transport tech kept his phone steady on Camden's forearm, Lena's bruising throat, and the room clock above the supply alcove. The resident, with student loans and shaking hands, had emergency documentation open on his tablet now, typing in clipped bursts without looking down. The charge nurse, who had hidden behind barcodes, stood beside the trauma kit with tears drying on her cheeks and a pen light in her hand, waiting for release so she could assess Lena's airway. The second space opened. Room 3C alarmed again, and this time the sound cut through every excuse left in the hall. Through the glass, Miles Rourke's chest rose too fast, then stalled, then fought for rhythm. A nurse in the room signaled 2 fingers for saturation drop and pointed hard at the door. Chief Rourke had spent a lifetime in service, and now his body was running out of time, while Policy Theater held his respiratory therapist against steel. Lena took one ragged inhale through the narrow gap she had won and felt fire scrape from throat to sternum. She tasted copper and dry plastic from the crash cart handle pressed against her shoulder blade. Her hand stayed on Camden's wrist because hands remembered tasks, even when vision tunneled. She did not think about heroics. She thought about Eli's untied shoelace, the challenge coin in his palm, and Miles whispering that Ghost found truth faster than men. That sentence sat in her like ballast. She locked her eyes on Trey and held there. At 3:14 a.m., the overhead page announced a routine environmental services request 2 floors down, indifferent and tinny, and the normalcy of it made the corridor's violence feel even sharper. Camden heard the page too and tried to use the tiny distraction. He jerked Lena higher against the crash cart and angled his phone toward Trey. "You're trespassing in a critical care zone with an unauthorized animal," he said. "I can end your access tonight. I can end her license before sunrise." Trey didn't blink. NWU sleeves taut over scarred forearms, shoulders square, breathing even. "You're done," he said. 2 words. No volume. The line hit harder than a shout. Camden's grip tightened by reflex, and Ghost moved exactly 1 step, not toward Camden's throat, not toward chaos. He stepped into line between Camden's leash hand and Lena's center line, shoulders rising, paws set wide for traction. Ghost's ears rotated forward and pinned there, his body locked. A low growl built in his chest, steady as distant machinery. Trey's hand settled lightly on the leash near the clip, not pulling, just claiming control. The first security officer spoke through a dry mouth. "Mr. Prescott, release now." Camden's laugh came brittle. "You touch me, you lose your badge." The second officer answered without heat. "Not tonight." The corridor stayed tight and bright and brutally specific. A visitor in a flannel blanket stood with one hand over her own throat, mirroring Lena without realizing it. The janitor kept both palms on the mop handle, like he was anchoring himself in heavy weather. Eli stayed behind the woman, shielding him in the alcove, small fingers gripping her sleeve, eyes fixed on the room door where his grandfather lay. He could hear the alarms. He could not see the hands around Lena's neck. Mercy looked like obstruction sometimes. Trey shifted his weight half an inch. Ghost mirrored. Camden saw that synchronization and finally understood he was not facing improvisation. He was facing a team that had done this kind of math where mistakes killed people. "Back off," Camden said, voice rising now. "My father sits on the board. I run overnight operations. I say who comes in, who gets written up, who gets escorted out." No one moved for him. Lena forced air past swelling tissue and got one phrase loose. "Variance, approved clinical, rationale." Camden snapped his head toward her, startled she could still speak. That micro-turn cost him alignment. Trey saw it instantly. Right wrist overcommitted on the phone, left forearm high and unstable, hips squared instead of bladed, ego holding structure together where training should have. Room 3. C's alarm flattened into a sustained warning tone. Inside, a clinician called, "We need RT now." That did it. Even the nurse who had frozen first stepped forward with its suction tubing and an ambu bag, ready to hand off the second Lena cleared. Bystanders were not bystanders anymore. They were personnel waiting for the breach point. Camden felt control leave in layers and lunged for the old script. "Say no animals," he hissed at Lena, close to her ear. Less performance now, more desperation. "Say it." She coughed, swallowed pain, and whispered, "Bring Ghost." It barely carried. It didn't have to. Every person in earshot heard it. Trey's eyes stayed on Camden's face, and Camden looked back long enough to meet something he had never had to read before. Not anger, not panic, not a bluff built on status. It was operational calm. The look of a man who had already decided the exact second this ended and was only waiting for the safest angle for the victim. Camden's confidence cracked visibly. Trey gave security a single nod. The first officer moved for Camden's phone arm. The second reached for the leash loop cutting into Camden's wrist. Camden reacted too late and in the worst direction, trying to wrench both arms inward while still pinning Lena. Trey entered center line in one clean step, caught Camden's choking wrist with a two-point grip, and redirected it off Lena's throat with economy that looked almost gentle until Camden's knees dipped from the leverage. The sound was small, not a cinematic snap. A hard, controlled joint check and Camden's sharp intake when pain replaced certainty. Lena dropped forward into waiting hands. The charge nurse and respiratory resident caught her under the arms and guided her to the wall, heads close, voices clipped. "Airway pattern?" "Partial. Strider present. Get her seated. Ice. Vitals now." Lena's first full inhale turned into a violent cough that bent her at the waist. The second came deeper. The third hurt less. She pressed a trembling hand to her neck and looked up in time to see Ghost rise, silent and towering at Trey's left side, body a wall between Camden and everyone else. Camden tried to twist free, face flushed, phone clattering to tile and skidding under the crash cart. "Get off me! Do you know who I am?" Trey didn't answer. He kept Camden's wrist extended away from his body, rotated just enough to kill leverage, and stepped him into the open space security had created. "Cuff him," Trey said. "The officers did." Officers. Restraints clicked around Camden's wrists with a mechanical finality that seemed to hush the whole floor for one heartbeat. Then sound rushed back. Dispatch on radio requesting status. Room 3C alarm still pulsing. Lena coughing. Someone crying softly in the alcove. The transport tech saying to his camera, voice unsteady, "Time is 3:15. Subject restrained. Clinician released." Camden bucked once against the hold and failed. He looked from Trey to Ghost and back, searching for a crack he could still use. He found none. Ghost's gaze never left him, ears forward, chest still. A veteran dog reading intent faster than speech. "My father will bury all of you," Camden said. But the line had gone thin, stripped of its old force, and the first security guard keyed his radio. "Code Gray contained. 1 in restraints. Staff victim conscious and breathing. Request a law enforcement and supervisor to ICU third floor corridor. Preserve scene and digital evidence." "Copied," dispatch replied. The charge nurse knelt in front of Lena with a pulse ox and pen light, voice breaking on the first word and steadying on the second. "Stay with me. Look at me. Can you swallow?" Lena nodded once, then winced. "Hurts." "I know. Don't force voice." Lena turned her head toward room 3C. "Miles," she rasped. "We've got him," the resident said, already moving toward the door with equipment. "You bought us time." Across the corridor, Trey finally released pressure to transfer full custody to security. Camden sagged against the officers, stunned more by the loss of narrative than by the restraint itself. He stared at Trey's face as if trying to find the social cue that might reopen negotiation. What he found instead was that same cold steadiness, unchanged from the moment Trey stepped out of the cross-corridor shadow. That was when Camden understood the size of his mistake. He had spent years mistaking fear for respect, silence for consent, and policy language for moral cover. In 3 minutes, in fluorescent light, in front of 21 witnesses and 1 recording lens he did not own, he had put his hands on the wrong throat while the wrong dog watched, and the wrong man arrived. Ghost did not growl now. He didn't need to. He stood beside Trey in that corridor at 3:15 a.m., tan and black coat catching hard white light, and his stillness restructured the room more completely than any shouted order ever had. At 3:18 a.m., the county deputies came through the ICU doors, and Camden learned that a family name could not talk over body cam audio. He tried anyway. "Take these cuffs off," he said, shoulders straining against the security hold. "Call your supervisor. Call my father. This is a misunderstanding." The older deputy, Sergeant Hall, looked at Lena's throat first, then at the transport tech's recording screen, then at Camden's phone under the crash cart. "Misunderstanding doesn't leave thumb bruises in a perfect grip pattern," he said. "Bag the phone." A younger deputy crouched, photographed the phone in place, then slid it into an evidence pouch with gloved hands. The lock screen still showed Camden's own livestream preview, frozen on Lena's face. Timestamp visible. Battery at 41%. Notifications from the private overnight thread stacking one after another. The transport tech handed over his recording without being asked twice. "Unedited file," he said. "Started at 3:12:41. I kept the clock and a room placard in frame." His voice shook once, then steadied. "I emailed a duplicate to compliance and myself." "Good," Hall said. "You'll sign chain of custody now." By 3:26 a.m., the corridor had turned into an active scene map. Blue tape marked Camden's standing position. Photos were taken of the crash cart rail, the leash loop marks on his wrist, and Lena's neck under oblique light. The charge nurse, who had kept scanning barcodes, sat at the nurse station counter with both hands around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. When Hall asked for her statement, she didn't hide behind policy language. "I saw him put his hand on her throat," she said, eyes fixed on the cup seam. "I kept scanning. I told myself it would stop. It didn't. That's on me." Hall wrote it down word for word. The resident with the upside-down tablet stepped forward next. "I recognized him from prior incidents," he said, nodding toward Camden. "I didn't call at first. I should have. I have screen captures from 2 weeks ago. Variance request marked closed from his terminal while the attending's co-signature was pending." "Send them now," Hall said. Lena, seated with an ice pack and pulse ox still clipped to her finger, asked for her locker key in a hoarse whisper. The first security guard brought it. She gave him the number. 10 minutes later, he returned with a thick manila folder. Screenshots, closure logs, copied complaint IDs, and the forwarded clip labeled "Night Shift Activist." Hall flipped the first few pages and nodded to his partner. "This is pattern evidence. Log all of it." Camden laughed when he saw the folder. The sound was brittle. "You think screenshots matter? My father's counsel will bury this floor." Trey said nothing. Ghost stood at heel, silent, eyes never leaving Camden. At 3:41 a.m., Dr. Ellen Ward arrived in a winter coat over scrubs, hair still damp from a rushed shower, and walked straight to Hall. "I filed board complaints on overnight coercion," she said. "I was told it was perceptual stress. I want that statement attached to this case." "It will be," Hall said. At 3:47 a.m., Chief Operating Officer Dana Kell, pulled from sleep and still buttoning her blazer, tried to route the event through internal incident review. Hall cut her off with one sentence. "This is now criminal assault, witness intimidation, and potential evidence tampering in a patient care area. Internal can wait." Richard Prescott arrived at 3:58 a.m. in a cashmere overcoat and fury. He didn't go to his son first. He went to the deputies. "Uncuff him," he said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Hall turned his body camera screen toward him. On the tiny display, Camden's forearm was under Lena's jaw, and his own voice was clear. "Say no animals." Richard watched 3 seconds and lost color in his face. At 4:02 a.m., the state health inspector on emergency call line, joined by secure video from the Capitol office, then requested immediate preservation of all overnight access logs, medication overrides, door badge histories, and deleted surveillance archives. IT tried to report the old routine corruption from Priya's complaint window. The inspector asked one question. "Was off-site backup enabled on that hallway camera?" Silence. Then an IT analyst answered from the doorway, "Yes, ma'am. Cloud mirror retained 90 days. It wasn't gone. It was hidden in a secondary bucket." That sentence broke the last protective layer. By 4:19 a.m., the recovered September clip of Camden grabbing Priya's wrist was playing on a monitor in the ICU consult room while deputies, compliance, and inspector staff watched in a tight semicircle. Priya, reached by phone, agreed to return and reopen her statement. Dr. Ward's earlier memo was pulled from archived council correspondence and appended as prior notice. The private chat logs from Camden's seized phone were mirrored under warrant request. 2 off-duty deputies in that chat were flagged for internal affairs review before dawn. At 4:33 a.m., the board's emergency quorum convened in Conference B. Richard Prescott took the head chair by habit. Dana Kell slid a printed order in front of him and said, "You're recused effective immediately pending investigation for enabling unauthorized credential access and retaliatory suppression." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He stared at the paper like it was written in another language. "This hospital has my name on it." Dr. Ward, standing at the wall, answered him. "Tonight, your name is on the evidence index." At 4:47 a.m., Camden was walked past the brushed steel Prescott Pavilion letters near the ICU elevator for transfer. Deputies paused him under the sign for identification photos, because location mattered for the charging packet. The family name entered the report as scene marker, not shield. The security guard who had frozen first asked Hall for one more form. "Supplemental statement," he said. "I want it on record that I delayed and why." He signed it with a hand that still trembled. The loaded looks in that corridor either found words or stayed empty forever. The visitor in gray who had prayed behind her blanket gave a witness statement and never learned Lena's name. The janitor who had gripped his mop handle said only, "I should have moved sooner," and asked for no credit. The resident who whispered "that's him" gave full testimony and attached his own delay to it. Nobody hid behind half sentences anymore. At 5:06 a.m., Hall returned to Lena with the printed case number, read it out slowly, and placed a copy in her hand. "This won't disappear," he said. "Not this time." Lena looked at Trey, then at Ghost, then through the glass toward room 3C, where alarms had finally softened to intermittent beeps. She nodded once. "Then clear him," she whispered. "Clear Ghost into that room now." Infection Control signed the emergency palliative waiver at 5:14 a.m., and for the first time all night, bureaucracy moved faster than fear. The door to room 3C opened, and Ghost entered like he understood he was stepping into sacred ground. Miles Rourke lay propped with high-flow cannula in place, skin gray at the edges, breath shallow and fast. Eli sat rigid in the bedside chair, challenge coin in his fist, eyes huge and sleepless. Trey stood at the foot of the bed and gave one quiet command. "Visit." Ghost approached in measured steps, old hip stiff for the first 2 paces, then smoother ascent took over. He placed his front paws against the mattress edge, lowered his head, and pressed the full weight of his muzzle into Miles's chest, just left of the sternum, exactly where the old chief's hand had searched in the air for hours. Miles exhaled like a man setting down a rucksack he had carried too long. "There you are," he whispered through cracked lips. Eli made a sound between a laugh and a sob and grabbed Trey's sleeve with one hand while reaching for his grandfather's fingers with the other. Trey moved closer so the boy didn't have to stretch. Lena stood inside the doorway with ice still wrapped at her neck, one hand on the frame, watching the monitor numbers climb in small, stubborn increments. Saturation 82, then 86, then 89, as Miles matched his breathing to the steady pressure of Ghost's head on his chest. Miles opened his eyes fully and found Trey. "Took you long enough," he said, a shadow of dry humor under the oxygen hiss. Trey's jaw worked once. "Traffic," he said. Miles' mouth lifted. He turned his eyes to Lena. "You kept the promise." She swallowed against pain. "Yes, Chief." He shifted his gaze to Eli and lifted 2 fingers until the boy threaded his hand through them. "Listen close," Miles said. "Leave no one behind doesn't end when uniforms come off." Eli nodded hard, tears running, still holding Trey's sleeve like an anchor rope. Miles looked back at Trey. "Had to do it this way," he murmured. Trey leaned in. "Do what?" "Make him grab where everyone could see." Miles paused for breath, Ghost staying perfectly still under his hand. Knew Camden prowled nights. Knew if Lena logged Ghost again, he'd come perform. Knew Ghost would alert on you before I could call. Dog finds truth faster than men. The twist landed in Trey's chest with the force of recognition. This wasn't only a dying wish. It was a final operation, designed by an old chief who understood corridors, predators, and timing better than administrators ever would. "You set the target," Trey said quietly. Miles's eyes closed and opened once. "Set the exposure," he corrected. "You set the stop." At 5:27 a.m., Sergeant Hall knocked once and stepped in just far enough to keep his voice low. "Charges filed," he said. "Felony assault, coercion, retaliation, evidence tampering review pending, controlled substance diversion investigation open from access logs. Board suspension served on Richard Prescott. Stayed hold on all deletion privileges. Your reports are locked and mirrored." Lena let out a breath she had been holding since 3:12. "Thank you," Trey said. Hall looked at Miles, then Ghost, then Eli's hand inside his grandfather's. "Take your time," he said, and backed out, closing the door softly. Inside the room, machines clicked and sighed. Snow tapped faintly at the window. Ghost stayed with his head pressed to Miles's chest, ears easing from alert to rest, for the first time that night. Trey put one hand over Eli's shoulder and the other around Miles's weathered fingers. 3 generations connected by skin, scar, fur, and promise. Miles's breathing thinned near dawn, but panic never returned. Each time his chest fluttered, Ghost adjusted pressure, and Miles settled. At 5:46 a.m., with Eli on one side and Trey on the other, Miles exhaled once, long and unafraid, and did not draw another breath. No alarm screamed. Lena had asked for comfort protocol and silence settings before this moment, and the room honored both. Eli pressed his forehead to the blanket and cried without restraint. Trey bowed his head. Ghost lifted his muzzle from Miles's chest, then turned and pressed his face into Trey's sternum, holding there, a veteran acknowledging another one. After the death pronouncement, Lena placed the challenge coin in Eli's palm. The eagle imprint matched the one she had seen hours earlier. "Keep this," she said. "He carried it for a reason." Eli closed his fingers around it and looked at Ghost. "Thank you," he whispered. Ghost sat beside him, leaned his shoulder against the boy's knee, and stayed. By sunrise, maintenance crews were already removing the brushed steel letters from the ICU donor wall under board order. When the final bolt came free, no one applauded. Justice did not need applause in that corridor. It needed record, consequence, and one room where a veteran did not die alone. That room had all 3.